Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ambition, Pragmatism, and Party, a political biography of Gerald R. Ford, by Scott Kaufman, narrated by Robertson Dean. Preface. On 9 August 1974, President Richard Nixon, facing impeachment because of his part in the Watergate scandal, resigned, becoming the first and only chief executive in American history to do so. That same day, his vice president, Gerald Ford, became the country's new leader. What made the events of that day even more remarkable was that 8 months earlier, Ford was the minority leader of the House of Representatives, where he represented Michigan's 5th District. He had become vice president only because the incumbent, Spiro Agnew, had also been forced to resign. Now, in August, Ford entered the White House as the country's only unelected president. Maybe it is because of the unprecedented way in which he became president that the overwhelming majority of the scholarship on Gerald Ford has focused on his tenure in the Oval Office rather than on his whole life. Indeed, only 3 works have made an attempt at a comprehensive political biography of America's 38th president. The first was brothers Edward Shapsmeyer and Frederick Shapsmeyer's Gerald R. Ford's Date with Destiny, but its disjointed, jumpy nature and publication nearly 20 years before Ford's death make it wanting. Far more readable is Douglas Brinkley's Gerald R. Ford, which covers the entirety of Ford's life. However, it is part of a series designed to offer short histories of each president, thus restricting the depth of coverage. The last, and most recent, is James Cannon's laudatory Gerald R. Ford, but the author passed away before he completed it, and the portions of the book on Ford's presidency read more as his memoir than as a scholarly monograph. It is possible that the dearth of biographies is due to the fact that, despite a 25-year career in Congress, Ford never sponsored a major piece of legislation, and he failed to achieve his dream of becoming Speaker of the House. Perhaps it is because, though he was intelligent, he was not an intellectual on a par with James Madison, John Quincy Adams, Theodore Roosevelt, or Woodrow Wilson. He was not a visionary like Thomas Jefferson or Franklin Roosevelt. Indeed, he had a difficult time seeing beyond specific policy proposals and placing them within a broader plan for the country. He did not have the complex personality of Lyndon B. Johnson or Richard Nixon. He was not the center of a major scandal. He was not a member of a famous family. He did not lead the country during a war. Or maybe it originates from the thesis that Ford was a caretaker president, one whose only decision of significance was to pardon Nixon, and who otherwise kept the chair in the Oval Office warm pending the outcome of the 1976 presidential election. If any of these explanations are correct, they are unfair, for they give short shrift to an individual who not only sat in the Oval Office, but whose life experiences and career in and out of Washington covered almost the entire 20th century. Born in 1913, he was raised by an abused mother who found happiness following a contentious divorce, and a stepfather who treated his stepson as his own. His parents suffered through the Depression, which nearly forced his stepfather to close his business. He fought in World War II and joined Congress shortly after the Cold War began. During his tenure in the House of Representatives, he participated in numerous debates, both inside and outside of Congress, regarding containment policy, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the emergence of détente with the communist world. Likewise, he spoke repeatedly on the extent to which the government should involve itself at home on matters ranging from civil rights to the environment, the economy, and welfare policy. Moreover, he witnessed a Republican Party that increasingly was at war with itself as the GOP's right wing emerged as a force with which to be reckoned. Though short, Ford's 895-day presidency was marked by more than the Nixon pardon. He oversaw the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. presence in South Vietnam. He had to address crises involving the Cambodian seizure of the American ship Mayaguez, Americans' use of energy, and New York City's finances. He sought as well to continue détente with the Soviet Union and tried to figure out how to help the economy emerge from stagflation. Repeatedly, he found himself pulled not only by conservatives in his own party, who challenged him for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1976, but an increasingly assertive Democratic-controlled Congress. After leaving the White House, he remained active within Republican politics, but he also began to move more and more to the political left on social issues, and he developed a close relationship with another former president, Jimmy Carter. Additionally, he used his title of ex-president to make a significant sum of money. During Ford's 93-year life, 3 themes emerged. The first was his ambition. Through hard work, he became an Eagle Scout and the captain of his high school football team, endeavored to become an attorney, and clawed his way into Yale Law School. He broke up with his first girlfriend so he could practice law in Michigan. During World War II, he served with the U.S. Navy, used his connections to rise up the chain of command on the aircraft carrier on which he served, and left the service with the rank of lieutenant commander. Not long after joining Congress, he decided he wanted to become Speaker of the House and allied himself with a group of younger lawmakers, the Young Turks, who helped him eventually rise to the position of Minority Leader. In that post, he sought to convince others to endorse a variety of initiatives he believed would be best for his party and the nation. Instead of becoming Speaker, he ended up serving as President of the United States, during which time he cajoled those who opposed him to see the wisdom of the positions he adopted. After losing the 1976 election, he toyed with running again in 1980, but, foregoing that option, he instead became a well-paid member of numerous corporate boards. His desire to assume positions of authority took its toll on Ford's family. He was an absent husband and father, which was difficult for his 4 children, but it was his wife Betty who took Jerry's absenteeism the hardest. She never considered divorcing her husband, but the time he was away made her feel ever more alone. She became addicted to alcohol, which she combined with painkillers she took for a bad back. Yet she refused to permit her suffering to stand in the way of his dreams. Indeed, in many ways she was as determined as he, taking positions as First Lady that were out of accord with those of Republican conservatives. She hoped that once she and Jerry left the White House, they would have more time together, but he continued to spend time away. It took a family intervention to help her give up her addictions, and she became a leader in the fight against alcohol and drug abuse. Second, in addition to seeking authority, Ford was loyal to the Republican Party. He was a moderate conservative, raised in a conservative district of Michigan, and in a family that reflected a conservative ethic of achieving success with little government assistance. He was a former isolationist who, as a result of his service in World War II, became an internationalist. Consequently, he developed a hawkish temperament on the issues of containing communism and supporting a free market economy. On domestic issues, he endorsed welfare programs, civil rights for African Americans, and environmental protections. He preferred, however, to have the states rather than the federal government enforce them. He participated in Wendell Willkie's bid for the presidency in 1940 and, as a congressman, established a voting record that was largely in line with that of the Republican presidents under whom he served. After becoming president, he promoted initiatives that harmonized with his moderate conservatism. As an ex-president, he campaigned for Republicans seeking both state offices and the presidency. Ford's fealty to the GOP caused him to be inconsistent. As a hawk, he called for heavy spending on the military, but stood behind Dwight D. Eisenhower's call for curtailing expenditures on the armed forces in the name of balancing the budget. He resisted policies that in his mind smacked of appeasement to the Soviet Union, such as talks aimed at restricting the testing of nuclear weapons. Yet, under President Richard Nixon, he became a champion of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, and, as president himself, pursued a SALT II agreement. As a congressman, he railed against China, but he later stood behind Nixon's rapprochement with the communist country. His loyalty also led him to overreach at times. He attempted to impeach Supreme Court Justice William Douglas in what appeared to many observers to be revenge for the Senate's refusal to confirm two of President Nixon's nominees to the court. Ford could also be naive, which, in combination with his friendship with Nixon, convinced him that the former president had had no part in the Watergate scandal, even as evidence to the otherwise became overwhelming. Ford, however, was a pragmatic partisan, and it is his pragmatism that constitutes the third theme of this biography. Inspired by loving parents who were known for decency and goodwill, Ford developed a reputation for honesty and a strong sense of right and wrong. He was not an ideologue, though. Just as winning a football game required cooperating with other members of the team, so rising up the political ranks and achieving one's goals necessitated a preparedness to compromise and to build coalitions with those whose views might not accord with one's own. Doing so offered a mixed bag for Ford. In Congress, he became known among his fellow Republicans as someone who was approachable and willing to listen to all sides before making a decision. He also exhibited a readiness to work with Democrats, particularly on foreign policy, but also to some extent on domestic matters. Yet before and during his tenure as minority leader, that willingness to reach across party lines oftentimes brought Republicans in alliance with conservative Democrats, whose positions, particularly with regard to race, were not necessarily those Ford favored. As president, Ford wanted to see the country continue down the path of fiscal conservatism and internationalism he had preached as a lawmaker. Building the alliances he had sought to create while on Capitol Hill, though, proved increasingly difficult. By the mid-1970s, conservatives in his party had grown in strength and did not favor many of Ford's decisions, including those related to his pick for vice president, relations with the Soviet Union, or tax policy. A Democratic-controlled and reform-minded Congress determined to rein in presidential power also constrained Ford, who signed legislation that was not fully in accord with what he wanted. That Ford refused to give up his pragmatic partisanship, however, became apparent after he left office. He developed a close friendship with a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, and adopted positions that oftentimes were not in line with the GOP that had continued to move rightward. Today, polls of laypersons and academics place Gerald Ford among the ranks of mediocre presidents. 56% of Americans ranked Ford as average in a 2013 Gallup survey, and a Quinnipiac University poll of registered voters taken the following year found that of the 12 chief executives who have served since World War II, Ford ranked 11th among the best presidents and 8th among the worst. A C-SPAN poll of U.S. historians in 2009 placed Ford 22nd among the 43 presidents. Even if a closer look at Ford's life and politics does not change these impressions, his career will allow readers to experience a period when, despite sometimes vigorous partisan debates, words such as compromise and cooperation were heard much more often in Washington. 1. A Ford, not a king. She had had enough. The physical and emotional abuse had become more than she could take. So, in July 1913, Dorothy King took her infant son, fled her Nebraska home, and crossed the Missouri River to her parents, who were waiting in neighboring Iowa. It was a first step to a much better life for her and her newborn child, one that set him down a path toward political leadership. The child's name was Leslie King, Jr., but he would become known as Gerald R. Ford, Jr. Between his birth and his 35th birthday, when he entered the U.S. House of Representatives, Ford benefited from a combination of luck on the one hand, and on the other, his mother and stepfather, coaches, military officers, girlfriends, and acquaintances from whom he learned the values of patience, determination, honesty, spiritedness, and faith in human nature. He also discovered within himself an overwhelming ambition and a desire to assume positions of leadership. His drive to success was not without its challenges and disappointments, but it was clear to those who knew him that he was one who would not give up on achieving his goals. Ford's mother, Dorothy Gardner, was the granddaughter of Alexander Gardner, who had arrived in America from Scotland, and Sally Miller, whose family traced their lineage back to England. The Millers had moved from New York to Illinois sometime after Sally's birth, and it was in the Prairie State where she met Alexander. Married in 1839, they had 6 children, the youngest of whom, Levi Addison, was born in 1860. At age 24, Levi exchanged vows with Adele Augusta Ayers in Harvard, Illinois. The couple had two daughters, Tenise, born in 1887, and 5 years later, Dorothy. Levi developed a successful real estate business and apparently enjoyed politics, serving for a year as Harvard's mayor. Long after he had been President of the United States, Gerald Ford recalled Dorothy's parents as very kind. This kindness passed on to their daughter, who by all accounts was religiously devout, warm-hearted, gregarious, and a great conversationalist. As events were soon to make clear, she was also an emotionally strong individual who was prepared to stand up to those who tried to intimidate her. In 1912, Dorothy married Leslie Lynch King, one of 5 children of a well-off Omaha family. King's father, Charles, was a merchant who in the 1880s had made a fortune establishing stores and banks along the route of what became the Chicago and Northwestern Transportation Company Railroad. He also helped found several towns, including Chadron, Nebraska, where Leslie was born in 1884. Charles moved the family to Omaha in 1908, constructed a mansion there, and continued to build his fortune, amassing some $20 million. Dorothy and Leslie met while she was a student at St. Mary's Academy, a woman's college in Knoxville, Illinois. Her roommate was one of his sisters. The tall, handsome, and blonde 28-year-old King and the beautiful 20-year-old Dorothy appeared to be a match made in heaven. After a brief courtship, King asked her father for her hand, assuring him that he was well off, had a good job in his father's company, and could give her a comfortable life. Levi had no reason to doubt the young courter. A prosperous businessman himself, he knew that Leslie's father was a multimillionaire. Nor did Adele see any cause for concern. With her parents' consent, Dorothy and Leslie married in September 1912, and then boarded a train for the West Coast and their honeymoon. Dorothy's expectation for a blissful marriage rapidly dissolved when King hit her repeatedly during that West Coast trip. Not only was he malicious, but he was mendacious. Upon returning to Omaha, Dorothy discovered that her husband and father-in-law were on poor terms. The elder King refused to provide his son with financial support. The younger King had been stealing money from the father's business, and despite his thievery, Leslie was deeply in debt. A brief reconciliation gave way to more violence, and to complicate matters, Dorothy in December learned that she was pregnant. Possibly because she did not want to leave her child without a father figure, Dorothy tried her best to salvage her marriage. She found support from her father-in-law, who agreed to let her use his large home for the baby's delivery and made sure she had a doctor and nurse to provide care, and from her mother, who arrived from Illinois. On 14 July 1913, she bore a son, whom she and Leslie named Leslie Jr. But if she believed that having a child would change her husband and rescue their marriage, she was wrong. King continued to terrorize his wife, and even threatened to kill their child. Fearing for both her life and that of her son, Dorothy called a lawyer, who told her to leave Nebraska. Not even taking time to pack clothes, she boarded a carriage and headed across the Missouri River to Council Bluffs, Iowa, where her parents were waiting to take her home to Harvard. Afterward, Dorothy filed for divorce, winning not only custody of her son, but an order for Leslie Sr. to pay $3,000 in alimony and $25 a month in child support. Having recently been fired by his father, Leslie claimed impoverishment and inability to pay. Charles stepped in, promising to make good on the court order. In a way, Dorothy could relax, for she was free of her tormentor and had money coming in from his father. Yet she faced the stigma of being a divorcee. While commonplace in the 21st century, divorce was not usual throughout much of America's history. Rather, it was associated with scandal, psychological defect, and societal failure, and it was considered particularly disgraceful when there were children involved. Knowing that she could not stay in small-town Harvard, Dorothy moved to Chicago, where she had family, and found a place in Hyde Park. Her parents also left Harvard, not for Chicago, but for Grand Rapids, Michigan, where Levi's company had an office. Shortly thereafter, Levi was diagnosed with kidney failure, and Dorothy and her son traveled with increasing frequency to see him. By the time he passed away in 1916, she had left her job in Chicago and moved to Grand Rapids to live with her mother. Situated on the Grand River, which is also Michigan's longest river, Grand Rapids is about 25 miles east of Lake Michigan and is the seat of Kent County. Native Americans had lived in the region for thousands of years, including the Hopewell and Ottawa tribes. Europeans arrived in the area in the early 1800s and established a trading post. By the mid-1840s, that post had become a town with a population of approximately 1,500. It was over 87,000 at the turn of the 20th century. While gypsum mining explains some of this growth, the area's forests were the key. With 35 million acres of both hard and softwoods, Michigan appeared to have an unlimited reserve of trees, and the Grand River provided a means of transporting fallen timber to mills at Grand Rapids. As the 1800s neared their end, the city had become a center for furniture manufacturing, earning the nickname Furniture City, supported by a number of attendant industries, among them the manufacture of paint and varnish. After 1900, a small automobile firm, the Austin Automobile Company, also began operations. Industry meant jobs, and immigrants flooded into Grand Rapids to find work. The largest group was the Dutch, who constituted over 25% of the city's population in 1900, but Poles, Germans, Swedes, and Lithuanians had made it home as well. Ethnic neighborhoods and a wide array of churches and temples reflected this diversity, but even more apparent were the class divisions. Downtown lay along the Grand River, and just to the east was a hill. That area became known as the Hill District, where the lumber mill owners and other wealthy individuals resided. Further east, the east side, was populated by middle and upper middle class families. The west side contained predominantly blue-collar families. Overshadowing the ethnic differences in Grand Rapids was a population that largely adhered to what has been referred to by scholars and by Ford's contemporaries as a Midwestern form of conservatism. Like political conservatives, they touted limited government and fiscal frugality. But what set them apart from others of conservative bent was their non-fundamentalist piety and, more importantly, their political moderation and pragmatism and their willingness to engage in compromise. Further drawing the city together was an excellent transportation system, particularly the electric streetcars that made it relatively easy and inexpensive to get from one's home to the city's downtown industries. Though not offering the diversions one could find in nearby Detroit or Chicago, the city provided a symphony, clubs, and theaters. Dorothy and her mother took advantage of what Grand Rapids had to offer, joining various organizations and regularly attending Grace Episcopal Church, located about 5 miles southeast of downtown. While attending Mass, Dorothy caught the attention of Gerald R. Ford. Ford was the son of George Ford, who had been born in Ohio, moved to Michigan, and married Zana Frances Pixley. Making their home in Grand Rapids, they had 3 children, the youngest of whom, Gerald Rudolph, was born in 1889 on the city's west side. His father had died in a train accident when Gerald was only 7. To help support his family, he dropped out of school in the 8th grade and never completed his education. He worked selling paint and wallpaper for Haystack and Caulfield, located in the east side. Ford was by no means as wealthy as the Gardeners, but he was financially stable. Dorothy did not care that her family was better off than Ford's, for she had learned the hard way that money did not buy happiness. And there was much to like about him. He was physically attractive, standing just over 6 feet tall, with a rectangular face marked by penetrating eyes and an aquiline nose, and a slightly receding line of black hair that he parted down the middle and combed straight back. He was also religiously devout, friendly, emotionally mature, and well respected in the city, in part because of his active community service. He was in many ways the very opposite of the man from whom she had escaped a few years earlier. In 1915, the two began dating regularly. Whether her family approved is not clear, though there is evidence that her mother was less than pleased because of Ford's social status. What was certain was that Dorothy had no intention of rushing into another marriage. waiting until February 1917 to exchange vows. Ford's stepfather and mother rented a home on Madison Avenue near the corner with Franklin Street, where there was a firehouse with the city's last horse-drawn steam engine. Ford recalled that when it went out on a call, the sight was spectacular. The Fords stayed there until 1919, when they moved to a home on Rosewood Avenue. It was an economically well-off part of town, with excellent schools, good health care facilities, parks, and safe neighborhoods. Those who lived there were, in the words of one author, thrifty, self-reliant, and active in civic affairs. The Fords could not have been happier. They loved each other deeply, and Gerald treated his bride with unfettered kindness and respect. The same was true for Dorothy's son, whom she began to call Junie Ford, as opposed to Junior, as well as Ford's half-brother Tom, to whom Dorothy gave birth in 1918. The Fords were strict disciplinarians who made sure that Jerry and Tom told the truth, did their chores, and came to dinner on time. But they also had fun. Gerald taught his children how to swim and play sports, including baseball and football. He was part owner of a home on Lake Michigan, and each summer the family went there, where the elder Ford and his stepson fished. It was through his stepfather that Ford learned the importance of independent thinking and doing what he believed was just. While many of the younger Ford's interests and mannerisms began to reflect those of his stepfather, one feature did not: his temper. Like his biological father, he periodically would fly into a rage for no reason, throwing items or pushing or hitting people if he did not get his way. His anger appeared enough in kindergarten that his teacher years later referred to him as Naughty Junior Ford. Dorothy and Gerald began what became a years-long effort to get Junie to control his temper. If he exhibited anger, Dorothy would have him look at himself in a mirror to see how silly he looked, or she would laugh at his fists and try to tease him out of them. George was more direct, using classic motivational talk. As both were devout churchgoers, they also turned to the Bible and had Junie memorize Proverbs chapter 16, verse 32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city. Ford also discovered inspiration in Rudyard Kipling, whose poem If begins, "If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you." By high school, the younger Ford had made great strides in controlling his temper, though it did reappear periodically, and credited the love and devotion of his parents as fundamental to his success at doing so. Junie, who decided to take the name Jerry after the man he believed was his biological father, also had to address his stuttering, which began when he was in second grade. It is not clear how long the problem continued, but it certainly affected his self-confidence. Worried about his stammering, he became less and less willing to express himself orally. Another teacher realized that the cause of the problem was that Ford was naturally left-handed, but school custom called for using one's right hand. When he was permitted to use his left hand, the stuttering stopped. Still, the experience had long-term consequences, for throughout elementary and secondary school, Ford became known as someone who was friendly, minus his increasingly infrequent periods of anger, yet taciturn. About this time, Ford's father ran into financial difficulties. Harry Haystack, Jr. had acquired Haystack & Canfield in 1921 after his father passed away, and he began making some poor business decisions that eventually forced the company to close in 1925. One of those decisions was to fire Gerald Sr. He got employment as a salesman for the Grand Rapids Wood Finishing Company, but his salary was not enough to cover the mortgage on the family home. Foreclosure followed. The Fords found a place for rent on Union Avenue, not far from where they had lived after Dorothy and Gerald married. It may have been because of the strain on their finances that Jerry's parents suggested he become a caddy at a golf course in Grand Rapids. Additionally, he could learn to play the game. He refused, preferring instead to play football and read, particularly books by Horatio Alger and poems by Edgar Guest. Alger, Ford later commented, wrote stories about heroes, poor boys who struggled and eventually succeeded. Appearing in the Detroit Free Press, Guest's verses offered a sentimental perspective on daily life. Despite his dismissive
Sample complete. Ready to continue?